Good afternoon. I am Eugenio Cusumano, and I'm an assistant professor. I'm a political scientist, actually, not a sociologist, unlike perhaps many of you. I am an assistant professor in international relations at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. However, the institution that make my presence here possible, thanks to their generous sponsorship, is the NATO Center of Excellence on Civil-Military Cooperation, based in The Hague, for which I am a research fellow, and I'm really flattered to be their academic ambassador here. If there are any questions about the CCOE, I will be happy to pick them up later. But now I will turn to my presentation, considering that there isn't too much time available. As you may already see from this title here, the presentation that I'm giving is not what you will see in the program of the conference. On Yagil's suggestion, I decided to present another project that I've been working on that perhaps connects better with some of the underlying themes of these conferences, such as the de-democratization of military force that both Yagil Levy and Professor Burke talked about. Before starting, I have to add that this presentation is given strictly in my personal capacity as a civilian academic, not as a fellow at the CCOE. Without any further ado, let us now go on to study and understand a little better what are the political drivers of the increasing privatization of military force, of the increasing outsourcing of tasks such as logistics, security, and reconstruction in the theater of deployed operations. This is what I will be talking about today. So this is, very quickly, the outline of this presentation. I will first introduce the existing explanations of the increasing use of private military and security companies, PMCs. I will then move on to introducing my own explanation based on Neoclassical realism, and then assess this explanation against the empirical evidence provided by the cases of the United States and the United Kingdom, before wrapping up with some conclusions and perhaps some requests for advice from your part, which I would be delighted to have. So, considering the underlying question that is driving my research, why are advanced military organizations increasingly relying on private military and security companies? Two main families of academic explanations can be found. Advocates of the increasing outsourcing of military support have argued that military privatization basically makes sense. It is a way to increase military preparedness at decreased cost, something that is increasingly needed in a context of multiple operational commitment and budgetary constraints. Now, this explanation provides valuable insights, but it also suffers from some shortcomings. First of all, if you look at the existing evidence that has been deployed, there isn't really so much support for the idea that outsourcing deployed support is always cheaper. Indeed, there is even some evidence of the contrary. Of course, a case-by-case analysis is needed, but there isn't so much solid evidence that it actually saves so much money, especially in cases in which duplications are created. Sometimes when soldiers cannot be deployed, basically a contractor is hired to perform tasks that could be conducted in-house if military personnel were actually available for being deployed into operations. The effectiveness of outsourcing military support is also disputed. Of course, some tasks could be more problematic than others, but just to give you an example here, in a context of a counterinsurgency operation, it was found out by a US Senate investigation that 43 of the companies that the US Army alone was relying on in Afghanistan actually had ties to the Taliban. By outsourcing support, the United States military basically ended up subsidizing the Taliban insurgency. Another problem of material explanations, material explanations of military change at large, they converge in expecting military isomorphism. If something makes sense, if something increases military effectiveness, then we should expect all military organizations facing similar incentives and constraints to behave the same way. And yet, when it comes to the outsourcing of military support, we see substantial differences across military organizations. Some outsource more than others, even if they actually face the same incentives and constraints. This is why most of the academic literature has turned to ideational or ideological explanations in order to explain military privatization. They've basically argued that the increasing outsourcing of military support has gained momentum due to the rise of neoliberalism, which has informed military organizations as well, based on the belief that private providers of services are actually better capable of providing tasks more efficiently and effectively than states' organizations, including armed forces. Yet, even countries sharing similar political ideologies, such as, for instance, the United States and the United Kingdom, do not really outsource military support to the same degree. And also, ideational explanations are quite problematic when it comes to explaining variance in contractor support over time. I will actually show you some evidence that the use of contractors pre-exists the rise of neoliberalism. We see substantial reliance of contractors in Korea and Vietnam already. Also, what we see is that sometimes contractor support varies abruptly within the course of the same military operation. So I contend that a political explanation looking at the interplay between constraints over the mobilization of military personnel and the increasing use of contractors is actually better capable of explaining these variations. Of course, my explanation is not entirely new. Various scholars have hinted at the idea that perhaps military privatization has gained momentum not only because it is financially effective, but perhaps because it is politically cost-effective as well. This is a widespread claim you can find in the existing scholarship. However, it has remained really underdeveloped. It has been made more as an innuendo than as a testable, empirically falsifiable claim. Also, very little evidence for this has been provided, based only or almost only on the case of the United States and Iraq. And furthermore, there is this idea that an erosion of democratic control over the use of force has occurred as a result of outsourcing, but this was basically an unintended consequence, an externality of military privatization. So I'm building up on this scholarship, but I've tried to turn it into a sharper, empirically falsifiable claim, based on the idea that the higher the constraints over the deployment of soldiers in foreign operations, the higher the propensity to use private military and security contractors as a force multiplier. I've also tried to provide a comparative dimension to this claim, based on not only the United States, but also the United Kingdom, and research on some other case studies that I've been trying to conduct lately. So, for those of you who are not perhaps very familiar with international relations theory, I've been building on Neoclassical realism, which is a theory of international relations that builds upon neorealism in contending that the ways in which states conduct foreign policy and response to systemic external challenges is shaped by domestic political factors. Military mobilization strategies as well are shaped by domestic political constraints. The increasing use of contractors, I argue, is also in itself a new military mobilization strategy. The US total force, as well as the UK total force, which now are basically witnessing one contractor for each soldiers, is nothing but a new type of military mobilization, which has been shaped, it has been informed to a large degree by the increasing difficulty to mobilize manpower. So, if privatization has increased in order to circumvent the constraints on soldiers' deployment, what we should expect, the two hypotheses that we should expect, if you will, are that, first of all, the use of private military and security companies is indeed less vulnerable to mobilization constraints, to domestic political constraints, than the use of soldiers. We have some evidence for this, but then again, it is based only on the United States case, and it needs to be replicated to other countries as well. And then, of course, if this connection exists, we should expect that the higher troop mobilization constraints, the higher the propensity that private military and security companies will be used instead, and a host of support functions will be outsourced in order to provide military forces with a force multiplier. So just to summarize the causal mechanism that I'm hypothesizing in a nutshell, we see that the ways in which military manpower is mobilized when there is a need for troops, when there is a need for boots on the ground, as there was in both Iraq and Afghanistan as a result of the rise of the insurgency. This need for boots on the ground is shaped by domestic political constraints. Different examples can be made. For instance, parliamentary vetoes on troops deployments, or parliamentary manpower caps, ceilings to the number of troops that can be deployed to a certain theater, and perhaps at a broader level, casualty aversion as well. The higher these constraints, the higher the propensity that private military and security companies will be used as a replacement for soldiers. So, you're all perhaps very familiar with this one-to-one ratio of contractors used in both Iraq and Afghanistan. I will skip that. I will also skip the evidence that I've been providing. Perhaps we can leave that to the Q&A for the fact that contractors were being used as a way to circumvent domestic political constraints already in Korea, in Vietnam, and we already had some study of that, on Operation I4 and K4 in Bosnia and Kosovo, where a one-to-one ratio of contractors versus soldiers was reached. What is perhaps less known is that a one-to-one ratio of contractors used was almost reached in the UK case as well, where, as you can see, as of November 2010, in Afghanistan, at least 6,500 contractors, a figure that is most likely underrated, were used in support for 9,500 soldiers. Number of casualties among contractors are also especially striking. As you can see, there have been pretty much as many casualties among UK contractors than soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. In my research, I show that this increase in the use of contractors in both the US and the UK case was indeed shaped by tightening constraints over the mobilization of troops. UK forces in Afghanistan especially were plagued by a chronic lack of manpower, which was considered to be a political failure to match ends with appropriate means. Also, several domestic factors converge in tightening the constraints over troop deployments. Strong public oppositions against the conflict, various parliamentary attempts to restrict cabinet's war powers, and the declining cohesion of the new Labour Party in the wake of the 2010 elections. As a result of these pressures, in autumn 2009, a 9,500 cap on the number of UK soldiers that could be deployed in Afghanistan was established. As a result of that cap, within 6 months, the use of contractors increased by 250%, which I think is a forceful smoking gun, showing that a connection does exist between domestic political constraints and the use of contractors. What is most telling is that logistics was privatized in spite of the availability of uniformed personnel to conduct the same task. Those personnel, however, could not be deployed to Afghanistan because of the manpower cap. As a result, contractors had to be hired instead. And also, there was widespread concern among the military personnel that I interviewed that outsourcing logistics was deeply problematic. So, just to conclude, since I'm running out of time here, I think that this study shows that this plausibility probe that I conducted against 2 case studies is that there is the interplay between demand for troops and mobilization constraints shed valuable insights into variance in the use of contractors over time, as you can see from the increase in the use of contractors following the manpower cap that I showed you, and also the persisting outsourcing of certain tasks, even if there is some substantial evidence that, at least in the theater of a counterinsurgency, the use of private military and security companies can be deeply problematic. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.